webinar is being recorded, and that if you do not want to be in the recorded video, you may turn your video off. It is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and it should look like a little video camera. You can turn that off so you don't come up on the recording. But if you don't mind, then you are more than welcome to have your video on. Hello, hello. Okay, just gonna give it 2 more minutes. Wait. Again, hello, and thank you all for joining me this morning. For those of you who just came in, I just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and that if you turn your video off, your face will not show up in the recording. So if you are worried about that, just turn your video off, and you don't have to be in the recording. We are going to get started here. Just looks like some other people are just joining in, and that is totally fine. I hope that you can all see my PowerPoint. So I just want to let you know, if you do have any questions throughout this webinar, please feel free to either send me a chat through Zoom, or you are totally fine if you just want to unmute yourself and ask me any questions. It's a smaller group right now, so if you feel more comfortable asking a question in front of everyone, please feel free to do so. But we are going to get started here. So I just want to let you know that this presentation is brought to you by the AMI Farm at Augusta Health. This is a partnership between the educational nonprofit Allegheny Mountain Institute, whose mission is to cultivate healthy communities through food and education, and also the Augusta Health Hospital, located in Fishersville. So you have all day for the Storing and Preserving Your Harvest webinar. Hello, I am Tess Jacobson, and I am going to be your instructor today. I am the Outreach and Engagement Assistant for the AMI Farm at Augusta Health, and I am also a Phase 2 Fellow with the Allegheny Mountain Institute. So I just want to reiterate one last time, just so all of you know, because I know we did have a few more people show up, is that if you, we got some chats, if you do not want your video to be shown, please feel free to turn off your video. Yes, I just got a question. Will a copy of the recordings be available to us, or the presentation? So both of them will be available to you. I am going to send everyone who signed up for this webinar a email with the recorded webinar and also the presentation, along with a document, or a document with all of the resources and handouts that I talk about, because preserving and storage is a really broad topic, and since this is just a basic class, I am just going over the bases, and I will give you specifics in handouts and chart forms, so you don't have to actually memorize anything while we're going through this presentation. Just listen and come up with some questions to ask me would be wonderful. Yeah, so it looks like we are still getting some more people in right now, so I do apologize. I have to admit them in here before I can actually get over to the presentation. So from then on, okay, it looks like I don't have any more in our waiting room, and we are going to get started. So again, since we just had about 6 more people join us, hello, I'm Tess Jacobson. I'm going to be your instructor today, and this is for the Storing and Preserving Your Harvest webinar. This webinar is being recorded. Please feel free to turn off your video if you do not want to be shown in it. Going ahead of myself. So why preserve your harvest? Well, like me and like many people, I love to eat vegetables year round. But during winter, I have a hard time getting seasonal vegetables, correct? Because not as much is growing. It's hard to get connected with farmers who are actually growing things during that time. And so I have just recently gotten into preservation for the last few years. I've learned a lot from my grandparents, but this is one way to be able to eat seasonally all year round and eat those vegetables that you're growing in the spring and the summer, in the winter and in the late fall. So you still have that comfort of those vegetables year round. Um, so also other reasons would be extra. If you have an abundance, if you grow a lot, and you have an abundance of vegetables, this is a great way to be able to not waste your vegetables and be able to save them for later on in the year. Other reasons is that with fermentation and some types of canning and heating of vegetables, it actually can make certain vegetables, like tomatoes, heated up are more nutritious than if they were raw. And sometimes preservation actually makes things taste better. So these are all reasons why you might want to preserve your harvest. You want to be able to feed your family year round with stuff that you're growing, and that is why we're all here today. It's to just learn a little bit more about how to actually preserve your harvest. So is very, very broad. As you see, they have archaeologists have discovered dried fruits and vegetables from 12,000 BC, so a long, long time ago. So we know that preservation and storage has been a huge part of cultures forever. It has truly been able to make people grow roots in the place that they're harvesting this food and actually build communities. Beforehand, it was mostly hunting and gathering, but once preservation and storage became a big part of society, then we started to actually be able to settle down in communities and grow roots in different areas, because then we didn't have to follow our next meals. So some of the first things that happened was, like I said, a lot of dried fruits in more tropical climates. In more frozen climates, people would freeze their meats on slabs of ice. Just, very simple things like that. But, we think about it nowadays, and we still use a lot of those techniques and a lot of the basis that they did all of those years ago in what we're doing now. And I don't know if many of you know, but fermentation was actually an accident, is what they're thinking, is that some grain got left out in the rain and fermented, and that's actually how we came up with beer. So it's just, it's grown so much from when it first started, but we do have a lot of basis in the history. And if you are ever interested in the history, or more interested in the history of preservation and storage, there are a couple state extensions in the United States that have done a lot of research on the history of preservation and storage, and there's some really cool books and articles that you can really get into if that is something you're interested in. So another very important thing is how to actually plan your garden for preservation. I think about it, and we just, put parsley and cilantro and, random things in our garden this year, and we didn't necessarily think about, ahead. But one of the biggest things with planning your garden for preservation is thinking those seasons ahead. So when you're planting in, either spring or summer, depending on what crops you're thinking of, what are going to be the things that you're going to want to eat in winter? So what and how much are you going to eat and preserve is one of the most important questions you can ask yourself and your family. What is that final usage going to be? What do you like to eat? What does your family like to eat? What will be useful to you? So thinking about things like, well, do I want canned tomatoes, or would I rather have dehydrated tomatoes? How am I going to use those two different things? Also, like frozen peaches versus peach preserves. So depending on how you want to use them in the end is one of the biggest things for what you're going to actually have to grow in the beginning, if that kind of makes sense. What is your garden setup? Some people just do container gardening. Some people have raised beds. Some people have garden beds. No matter what your size is, I think everyone can be able to plan a garden for preservation. It just might have to take a little bit more work if you may not have the outside space to be able to plant all of those things that you want to plant, which is totally understandable. If you don't know much about planning your garden, you don't really know where to get started or anything like that, you feel free to email me, and I have a planning your garden resource guide that I can send out to anyone. So just let me know. I also have a gardening small resource guide, and that was also a webinar that could be sent out to you as well, if that is something you're interested in. So other things to consider would be harvesting once or multiple times. So some produce can only be harvested once and then it's done. So if that's the case, then do you have enough to be able to save some of it, or should you just eat all of that now? Other things like tomatoes, you can continue picking them throughout the season and it's just going to keep growing more. So maybe wait until you get that big harvest of tomatoes before you actually decide to preserve. I think one of the biggest things is thinking you don't want to do too much, at the start, because, excuse me, sorry, because you don't want to do too little either. So if you have like 5 tomatoes, you don't want to just preserve those tomatoes. You want to wait until a bigger harvest comes in. But then if it's too big of a harvest, then will you actually have the time to be able to preserve those? So preservation is kind of it can be a complicated topic, just because you want to make sure that you're preserving enough, for you and your family, but not too much that, you either don't have the space for it or you do not have time to actually follow through with it. So those are just some things to think about when you're planning out your garden and you're getting ready for preservation. I have to keep switching back and forth between Zoom and the PowerPoint if I want to see if anyone asks a question. So please give me time on that. I do apologize. Oh yes, here I'm gonna check, see if we have any late arrivals. Yep, here I'm gonna admit them in. Welcome. Sorry about that. Have to switch back and forth between PowerPoint and Zoom to you all in there. We just got started in it, so please, I am sending everyone the PowerPoint. So if you missed the first couple of slides, no worries. You'll have all of this with you. Okay, so one of the biggest things is harvesting for preservation. A lot of people think about, okay, well, I have to plan my garden. I have to, think about how much I want to actually grow. But another of the biggest things is harvesting for preservation. So timing, techniques, and tools, and quality are 3/4 things to really think about when you're harvesting. Use the best and eat the rest. So that was a quote that I was told when I first got started in preservation, in the preservation world, is to use the best. So use your best quality for preserving and then eat the rest. A lot of people are like, but why would I want to do that? Don't I want to eat the best things and then preserve the okay things? But if you think about it, you want to preserve the best because they will not have the bacteria that could possibly grow, or they will hold up better when preserving than, say, a partially rotting strawberry. It may contain things that could ruin the entire batch that you're trying to preserve, or just things like that. So those are things to consider. Timing is an important one for certain preservation techniques like freezing. It's actually said to be better to harvest things that are a little underripe rather than overripe. So just knowing when you should be harvesting your vegetables is something very important. that everyone should know. So again, you can check out our harvesting resource that we use, the Roxbury Farms Harvest Manual. It's going to be attached to the email that I'm going to be sending everyone out later this week with this PowerPoint and with the webinar. So take a look at that, and it'll tell you the timing, when certain vegetables and varieties should be harvested, the techniques and tools to harvest them properly, and what they actually should look like when they're ready to harvest. So all of those things are in the Roxbury Farms Harvest Manual, so I highly recommend looking at that if you are a little unsure about when some of your produce is ready to be harvested. So after harvesting your fresh veggies, or after harvesting your produce, you are going to have a lot of fresh veggies. So I have, again, attached the produce storage guide and veggie storage and preservation guide. So it's this little picture that's right to your right of the screen. It's going to be that, but bigger, so you can actually see what it says. And then there's also a chart that has like how long things can last in certain conditions and all that kind of stuff. So there are just some quick cleaning and storage tips here on the side. I'm just going to go through some of them because a lot of them some people just might not know, and they are important for storing fresh veggies. One of my biggest things is to make sure that you wash all of your fruits and veggies, even if they have rinds, especially if they have rinds. A lot of rinds, because of their bumpy skin, can carry bacteria, and a lot of people don't think to wash them. So if you don't wash them and you cut into that rind, that bacteria is going to get on the knife, and then it's going to completely go through the fruit and vegetables. So make sure to wash your veggies and your fruits, even if they do have rinds, before you use them, so you don't have those possible mix-ups. I'm not going to go through all of these fresh veggie cleaning and storage tips because you can read them right here. And so one of my biggest things that I've learned from AMI and just preserving and storing vegetables in general is to try to use the entire plant. So this is specifically for beets and other root vegetables, but the roots so I'm talking beets, radishes, turnips, carrots. We'll stick with those for now, but the roots can be roasted and eaten now, pickled and canned, pickled and put in the fridge. Roots aren't necessarily, or I have not frozen roots before, but not saying that you can't. You can freeze most vegetables that you cook with, so there is a possibility. I just have not done it. And greens and tops of roots, so again, the beets, turnips, carrots, radishes, those greens are edible, and so you can either saute them and eat them fresh now, or you can blanch them and freeze them, or you can actually turn them into a pesto and freeze them or eat now, or whatever floats your boat. So I just want to let everyone know that using the entire plant is an important way to, here I have more people in the waiting room, so I'm just going to admit them. Apologies. If it'll let me, there we go. Okay, so now we got the basics done. One of the trickier questions with preserving is how to choose which preservation technique to use. So I know we had kind of talked about it, but the final usage is highly important. Again, what do you like to eat? What does your family like to eat? If you don't like pickles and you make 50 jars of pickles, it may just possibly be a waste. So really thinking about the final usage and how you're going to want to use those vegetables and the produce. And if there are multiple ways that you think you could use them, then, why not do small batches of each of those rather than a big batch of something that you and your family are never going to eat. Flavor and texture is also a pretty big one. So high water foods lose texture after being frozen. So things like cucumbers, they turn pretty much to mush once you freeze them. So, that might not be necessarily something that you'd want to freeze, or you might not, that might not be interesting to you. So think about that. A huge one is available space, whether that's freezer space, fridge space, or shelf space. If you're preserving food, you're going to have to put it somewhere. So that's always something to keep in mind, is how much space you actually have and how much can you actually put up. And then one of the biggest things is, how long do you want it to last? So dehydrated and canned food most of the time tastes better and lasts longer, but fermented foods or vinegar pickled foods usually retain more nutrients, but don't last as long. So those are just some things to think about when you are trying to choose which preservation technique you want to use. And I'm just going to look real quick. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask me, or to put it in the chat. And I'll keep going back and forth and checking the chat box. It may take me a little while to notice that there is a question there, but just go for it. So these are the preservation techniques that we're going to go over quickly today. Freezing, canning, both water bath and pressure, dehydration, fermentation, and then dry storage and root cellars. Before we go in, again, I just want to say, because I know we've gotten some new people, I will touch on each of these techniques, but I am not going to be going in depth or telling you specific information on how long, like, this variety of tomato can last being canned. I am sending you a lot of handouts and resources that have all of those charts, have recipes, so please feel free to look through those once this is all over, and if you have any additional questions, that you can email me and we can go through it. Okay, so the first technique we're going to talk about is freezing. So freezing stops decay and growth through the cold. The general rule for freezing things is that you can freeze most vegetables that you cook with. Again, potatoes, cucumbers, and other vegetables don't necessarily freeze that well, so you may want to think about how the texture and the taste of what you want your vegetables, but that is a general rule, and you can actually freeze most fruits, not just ones you cook with, but just in general. Freezing preserves has more nutrients than canning, but it can change the chemical structure of some foods, and that's why some of them turn out to be more mushy than others. And so that may be a turnoff for a lot of people. So blanching vegetables, I don't know if some of you have ever blanched before, but blanching makes certain enzymes in vegetables inactive. So this helps preserve color, flavor, texture, and nutrient content. But blanching time really does depend on the vegetable and the size of the vegetable. So there is, in the attached Freezing 101 resource that I am going to be giving you, there is a chart that lists a good majority of fruits and vegetables and tells you, what their blanching times are and how to do it properly. Some of the things that you can freeze are any type of thicker green, so like kale, spinach, they can all be blanched and then frozen. Vegetables, some tomato products can be frozen, peppers, onions, some onions. There are a lot of different veggies that can be frozen. You can also freeze dried herbs. So that's a combination, and we'll kind of talk about combination preservation techniques. but drying herbs and then freezing the dried herbs will help those last a long time. And again, you can make certain greens into pesto and then actually freeze the pesto. So something for freezing is that a lot of people have been using vacuum sealers to help keep your food even more fresh in your freezer. This is the specific food saver that I have used before. And these just make sure that it takes truly all of the oxygen out to help keep the bacteria and the mold and yeast from growing. So these can actually help your lifespan of your meat, vegetables, fruit a little bit more in the freezer than, say, just a Ziploc bag. I'm going to sit here for a second. If anyone has a question, please feel free. Okay, so I have a question. Why blanch greens before freezing rather than just putting it in the freezer? So that is a great point. So because blanching makes some people like the color of greens. Blanching can actually make that color a brighter green. It also kind of takes the oxygen out of the fresh veggies or the fresh greens. And without that oxygen in the green, then it actually makes it harder for bacteria and mold to grow in them, if that makes sense. So that is why you would also blanch greens before, or blanch most vegetables before freezing them. I want to learn how to make pickled cucumbers. Well, good news, with everything, all the resources that I'm sending you, there are plenty of recipes on how to do pickled cucumbers. So just, keep an eye on that. Okay, so next we're going to head over to canning. So I know people have possibly heard about canning before. There's both water bath canning and pressure canning. Overall, canning helps to remove and create a sterile environment for your food. So just things to think about with canning. It does keep food preserved for a long time, so around a year. Some things they say less, some say you could probably push it to a couple years. It really depends on how well you're canning, into the quality of your produce. There's a lot of things that go into the lasting of your canned goods. Heat can activate nutrients. I know I had slightly touched on it. It does activate it in tomatoes. I'm trying to think of it's lycopene. I may be saying that wrong. In tomatoes, that if it's heated up, it releases this nutrient, and it's actually very healthy for you. So you can actually also make and save your own prepared foods. So this is things like hot sauce, ketchups, soups, again, pickles, all of those things that, you can buy at the store, you can actually preserve yourself. And something to pay attention to is for sure your altitudes. So if you're on sea level, then the water heats up faster or boils at a higher temperature, and the higher you get in altitude, the lower the temperature your water is going to boil at, and because of that, it might not get to the temperature that you need. Say for water bath canning, it might not get to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and because of that, it may not properly sterilize the environment, and so what you'd have to do is you may have to up your times. Again, in the Food Preservation Basics resource that I am giving you guys, it has all of these times, and it also has an altitude chart that'll let you know. You can look up your altitudes on Google. You can contact your state co-op extension. to figure it out. But yeah, that's just something to keep in the back of your head when you are thinking about canning. Okay, so for water bath canning, basically what a water bath canner is and does, it is basically just a large standard sized lidded kettle with a jar rack. It is designed for heat processing, 7 quarts or 8 to 9 pints in boiling water. What they say is that you should focus on doing that with like jams and jellies and fruits. You can also get away with doing some fermented foods and pickles and pickled products with a water bath rather than a pressure canner. The pressure canner reaches up to 240 degrees, so it is much higher temperature, and so that is specifically for low acidic or combination foods, just because you don't want botulism, which I know we haven't talked about here, but I am more than happy to talk about it here if anyone would like me to. But for pressure canning, this should mostly be for low acidic or combination foods, again, meat, soups, meat sauces, and vegetables. The USDA recommends that if you are going to can meat or honestly any type of vegetable, they recommend that you use a pressure canner for it. You are also supposed to get your pressure canner checked by your state extension at least once a year to make sure that it is properly working and that bacteria for botulism will not grow. So I'm just going to give you a definition for a pressure canner. So it is basically a specifically designed metal kettle. It has a lockable lid, and it's also used for heat processing low acidic foods. Canners usually have jar racks. They usually have safety devices, systems for exhausting air, and a way to measure or control the pressure. So it's a much more controlled environment for canning than a water bath canner is. And a lot of people just feel safer using a pressure canner than a water bath canner. But you totally have the option to use both. It just really depends on what you're wanting to can. So in the food preservation basics, and also in another chart that I'm sending you with the resources, it'll give you a chart of a ton of vegetables, fruit, meat, and it'll say what it recommends, either water bath or pressure, and it'll give you how long it needs in each of those and all the information to be able to do that. Again, I'm going to look over to Zoom and see if we have any more questions. No? Okay. Since we're talking about canning, I'm just going to quickly go into botulism because this, my biggest thing for everyone here is that I want to make sure that everyone is being safe with their preservation and with their storing of their vegetables. So botulism is an illness caused by eating toxin produced by Clostridium botulinum. I'm so sorry, I do not have that. I am terrible at saying words like that, so I do apologize if I just butchered it, but it is a bacteria, and it really, really loves moist, low acidic food containing less than 2% oxygen, which is very interesting. So it likes to be in that less oxygenated state and stored between 40 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a huge temperature fluctuation. So proper heat processing destroys this bacterium in canned food. So that's why people can, because it actually destroys it. So then hopefully it won't grow. And that's why you want the temperatures to get over a certain degree. So either 212 degrees and pressure it's 240, but it's just to make sure that it is killing that bacteria. Freezer temperatures inhibit the growth in frozen foods. I know botulism is usually more concerned with canning, low moisture controls its growth in dry foods, and then high oxygen controls its growth in fresh foods. So that's why with fresh foods, it's not as a bother or worry because there's so much oxygen in those fresh foods. But in high oxygen or in low oxygen, it can grow. So in canning, because you are taking a lot of the oxygen out of those spaces, that it can be a great place for botulism to grow. So just making sure you follow the procedures, make sure everything is sterilized before canning, during canning. And one thing I always say is always use approved recipes, either from the USDA or from your state co-op extension services, because they're the ones that have truly tested out these recipes and know that if you follow what they're saying, that you're gonna be doing it right. Just want to let everyone know that. We have a question, if I can get it up. I've heard of people using their Instant Pot for canning. What is your thought about that? Is it safe? No. Hello. Hi. Yes. So I have heard no. Do not use your Instant Pot for canning. A pressure canner is a very specifically made technology, and for that reason, it is specifically for pressure canning. Instant Pot does not have the safety mechanisms. Well, technically they do in some capacities, but not the capacity for pressure canning specifically. Also, it can't be checked by the state co-op every year to get approval, and they would tell you not to do that. So for pressure canning, I would say that is a no-go at all. Yes, I hope that answered your question. Okay. Sorry if you hear barking. Do you blanch and freeze tomatoes, or do you use a pressure canner? Do you blanch and freeze? You can freeze tomatoes, and we did, remove the skins before we froze the tomatoes. I have also I've used a water bath to can tomatoes, and you can also use a pressure canner. More people feel comfortable using a pressure canner than a water bath. With water baths, I will say that I have added acids to also try and help make sure that bacteria doesn't grow. So specifically for tomatoes. Tomatoes are one of those vegetables that are like on the border of should we use a water bath or should we use a pressure canner? And so you could do either. And if you do feel more safe, I would use a pressure canner. How do you add acid? Great question. So for canning, if you go to any type of store that has canning supplies, they'll usually have like a citric acid that is safe to use in canning, or I know a lot of people use like distilled white vinegar, and the recipes should have like the exact amount of acid you should add to however, pound of tomatoes or whatnot. Does that make sense? So it'll be in the recipe how exactly you should add the acid, but I have used both distilled white vinegar, apple cider vinegar, and also citric acid. Any more questions on canning? I know canning is probably it's the most complex one, and I could have a million I would rather have classes, but on canning specifically. I'm hoping we were supposed to have a canning workshop this summer. Hopefully that'll still be able to happen, and if any of you do want to learn more about canning and to do it hands-on, then we could do that together. Yes. Is there a book you would recommend on canning with recipes? So I'm just going to pick up, I have the complete guide to home canning, preserving, and freezing, and it was put out by the USDA. This is my best friend when it comes to anything I'm doing for preservation. You can find all of this online though, because the USDA has just put it out for free. So you can type in the complete guide to home canning, preserving, and freezing in Google with USDA, and all of these recipes, all of this knowledge is free online. I also have a list of books at the end of this PowerPoint to look over. Any more questions before we move on? Okay. Next one we're going to talk about is dehydration. So this is removing moisture, creating that dry environment, so it is hard for bacteria, yeast, mold to grow. So a lot of people say that there's a high initial energy because it can take a long time for things to properly dry out. But then it's pretty much, if you do it properly, then it is shelf stable and it can last for months. You're also able to dry things out, like I talked about earlier, and freeze things for it to last even longer. But whatever you do, choose, just, yeah. But dehydration retains a similar nutrient content to that of freezing your produce. And there are multiple different avenues for dehydration. You can use the sun, your oven, or a dehydrator. For sun drying, usually they recommend you using fruit with high sugars and acid content, just because this will help make sure that mold and bacteria isn't growing on it while it's drying out. So conditions for sun drying are pretty specific. It is possible, but like 86 degrees minimum with humidity less than 60%. Again, you don't want that extra moisture in the air for bacteria to grow. And it does take a few days if you're doing it by the sun. So it, again, high initial energy for you, making sure that it's not going to rain on the stuff you're trying to have dry out in the sun or anything like that. You can use your oven, and it's pretty ideal for occasional drying. I do not dry a whole lot, but occasionally I do, and so when I do use my oven. You do want to set it at the lowest possible temperature, like 140 degrees or below, preferably like if you have that warm setting on your oven. And then you want your oven cracked a couple inches, like 2 to 4 inches, to make sure that there's proper ventilation in there. And using your oven does take about twice as long as a dehydrator. So for a dehydrator, you can pretty much dry anything in it. And there are like knobs on the dehydrator for like herbs or fruit or flowers, or, so you can set the temperature to what you are actually dehydrating. But yes. Another big thing with dried food is that it is smaller and lighter than in weight than it is fresh. So about 4 pounds of fresh produce usually equal about 1 pound of dried produce. This can make it easier for you to go on hikes with dried food or to store it more compactly. So those are all different reasons why you may want to choose dehydration over other preservation techniques. Any questions on dehydration before we move on? We'll look at okay, so we got, okay, how long does dehydrated food last? That is a great question. It depends on what you're actually dehydrating. It can be anywhere from a couple months to longer. Again, in the Dehydration 101 resource, it does have a chart with everything that you can dehydrate, or just about everything you can dehydrate, and will have how long it lasts dehydrated. That's not something necessarily I have on the top of my head right now, and I do apologize, but it is in that resource that you will be getting. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so one of my favorite ways of preserving food is fermentation. So fermentation increases that beneficial bacteria to crowd out the harmful bacteria. Some of you may be saying, what? That is wild, but it is the truth. And fermentation is such an interesting subject, but it increases beneficial bacteria. So you're eating beneficial bacteria, and it's actually very, very good for your gut. It makes your gut feel better. It usually can help your gut biome overall if you do eat fermented foods. So downside is that you store fermented foods at a fairly cold temperature. So this usually means it has to take up fridge space. And fermented foods is very controlled, and so that they say anything below 4.6 pH scale is safe to eat as a fermented food. They would like you to continue fermenting foods if you are to around 4.1 or lower for safety concerns. Between a 4.1 and a 4.6 pH level, you for sure have to store it in fridge space. Sometimes for lower fermented foods, you may be able to store it in like a cold storage or cold storage, or dry storage, depending on what the temperature of the room is like. So those are just things to think about. I know fermentation is also another big one that people really want to learn about. We'll also hopefully have a fermentation workshop this summer. So if anyone wants to, come get your hands dirty and learn how to make sauerkraut and fermented pickles. You can also can ferments, and so you would be able to store some ferments if you wanted to. Any questions on fermented foods? I know that is a very, very basic. Is kombucha a fermented food? Yeah. Food, I guess drink, yes. Do you have a recipe on how to make it? I do actually have a recipe on how to make it. It is currently not in my resource guide that I'm sending out, but I can add it to it. And that is a whole special recipe. Are pickled cucumbers fermented? You can have both just pickled cucumbers and also fermented cucumbers. So one thing I really liked comparing just a cucumber, or if I'm just cutting cucumbers up, putting it in a brine and canning it, it's going to taste a little bit differently than if I'm fermenting it. And so when I taste it, there's like this zing to a fermented pickled cucumber or fermented pickle. I don't know necessarily the proper terminology for that, but you can ferment cucumbers to make pickles. Does that help? And I do have recipes for that too. How do you ferment, please? Yes, I can share recipes for kombucha, for kimchi. But yeah, it's a different recipe for fermented ones, so that it's just slightly different how you would make it, which is very interesting. So I can share those recipes with you. Okay. So good fermentation. Okay, so dry storage and root cellars. Um, So for root cellars and dry storage are different things. A lot of people just kind of assume that they're the same thing, and they're used for different things, used for storing different things, different produce. Root cellars, you want to keep your root cellar between 32 and 40 degrees, but with a higher humidity, so 85 to 95%. You want to be able to control your ventilation going in or out of that room, so you can kind of control both that temperature and that humidity. So things that we'll put in our root cellar, or we have put in our root cellar, are boxes of sand with beets, carrots. I think those are the main ones we have in there. Sweet potatoes in there. Yeah, potatoes are also in our root cellar. For dry storage, you want the temperature to be 50 degrees at the max. 50 degrees for max shelf life, so that for things to stay longer, and humidity at that lower 50 to 55%. You also want it to be a well-controlled ventilation. Dry storage, a lot of people do onions, garlic, in dry storage, your winter squash, and also usually they're canned goods. So I know in our dry storage, we have all of our canned goods that we preserved over the year, and also our onions, garlic, and winter squashes are all in there. So one thing to remember with dry storage is that you might actually have to cure some things. So we had to dry our onions and garlic after we had harvested them for a couple weeks before we put them away in our dry storage. For winter squash, we did the same thing. So we cut them and we placed them in a warmer area than our onions and garlic, and they dried, and then they were able to be put into our dry storage. So for root vegetables, like I was saying, you can store root vegetables in sand in bins and root cellars. Any questions on root cellars or dry storage? Okay, so my biggest thing, of course, you probably all saw that, when it comes to preserving and storing your food, is to always remember to label it. You want to know what it is, what is the date that it was made and the year it was stored, so then you can always keep an eye on, what do I need to eat first, or what has gone bad, what should I get rid of if I have to, stuff like that. So having a label is to make sure that you are safe, pretty much. That's my biggest thing with this whole preservation and storage thing, is to make sure that everyone who wants to get into this is being as safe as possible, and remembering to label is probably one of the biggest things that you can do. So I was always told to label with a Sharpie and either a label or a piece of tape or something, rather than putting it on the top of the lid, because randomly some things can come off, it has happened, or even having multiple ways of labeling things. And if it's not in a jar, if it's in like a bin, making sure that the bins are labeled with, this is the garlic from 2020, just so you know what is safe to eat and what is not. A lot of people I know put on how long it can last in storage. So they'll say, okay, this was made December 31st, 2019, or January 1st, 2020, and then they'll put under that like 2 months, or it's not 2 months, but a year and 6 months or something like that. So then they know when that next date comes around that it's most likely not okay to eat anymore, and then they can just get rid of it and not have to question is it okay? Should I just try it, see if it's okay? No, just get rid of it. So that's another thing that you can put on your labels to make sure that you are being safe about your preservation and storage techniques. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? I know it's a very basic, I don't want to hold you for too much. Sorry, that did not mean to get out of here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. You can send me a private chat, a public chat, or you can email me. If I do not have the answer right now, I'll type up all of the questions and answers and send them to you when I send you all of your resources and the webinar. Please feel free. So again, in these slides, here are some book resources that I highly recommend. Here are some online resources for you to look at. Here are other webinars that we have had in the past on ergonomics, in the garden and farm, gardening small, and water conservation harvesting. So if you're interested in any of those, please check those webinars out. They've already happened. You just have to watch them on YouTube. And then we do have an upcoming class. Thursday, June 4th from 9:30 to 10:30, we have a Community Gardens 101. So please come join us and Project Grows along with a panel of our local experts to explore tips for community gardens and hopefully to create connections so we can all be growing locally. But yeah, I just want to thank you all so much for coming here and joining me on this lovely Wednesday morning. This turned out to be a beautiful day. I see the sun shining right now. But yes, here. Oh, thank you, Grayson, for getting the between pickling and fermenting. Oh, yes, I can show the screen of the past webinars, and here's that for you. I am going to be sending I had the question, will you email participants all the resources or should we email and request them? No, I'll send you, every single one of you that signed up for this class or this webinar, I will send you all of the resources along with this PowerPoint and this webinar that was recorded. So I just want to let you know, if you have any more questions, I am going to be on for a little while, so please feel free to ask. Yeah. Please, you can contact me at tess@amifellows.org, or you can just contact our general AMI at info@amifellows.org. Please feel free to visit our website and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Yeah,